Okay, on to lecture number 2 of the day. This one is going to be a little bit shorter. And I think you probably saw my wife pop in a moment, look kind of a little angry. She had to, she was vacuuming out the car. We had to move our sister's, or her sister's, pit bull. We drove her up to Folsom the other day to her new home up there, and everything's great, but that dog can shed. She's a big dog, and she sheds. And my wife was vacuuming out the car, and I think she was a little annoyed that she had to do that all herself. So that's why you might have seen her look a little grumpy. Into today's lecture, we are getting off of, oops, I gotta share this. Wait a minute. Getting off of the West Coast, heading to the Midwest with bleeding Kansas. Can be said, the first shots of the Civil War were fought in this, even though the Civil War didn't start then, but there was definitely Americans fighting Americans over the issue of slavery, years before the Civil War actually started. And before we get to that, though, we got to look at a few sort of culturally significant moments that were further driving these two parts of the country and these two sort of ideologies against each other. And we should start with defining what an abolitionist is. I think a lot of people, generally know abolitionists are against slavery, but that's not what abolitionist means. Abolitionists are people who are actively advocating to make slavery illegal, which was seen as an extreme position by a lot of people at this time. In the early 1850s, I think you probably only have maybe 5% of the U.S. of the white Northerners who are active abolitionists. By 1860, you might have maybe a little more than 10% of that would consider themselves to be abolitionists, but it's always a small minority. Even Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party, when Abraham Lincoln becomes president, he's very adamant he's not going to outlaw slavery. The Republican Party was all about just containing slavery. They don't want slavery to go into the new territories, but they promise they're not going to make it illegal in the places where it already exists. The Southerners won't believe them, and that's what's going to start the war, and that's eventually that's what ends slavery. But we're going to get to that. But the abolitionists are the people, the activists, are the people who say, no, this is a huge injustice to have slavery. We need to free all of the slaves now, make it illegal for all future generations. And famous names in this, like Horace Greeley was a famous newspaper editor. There's lots of these newspapers. They would have lots of meetings. Of course, like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, two former slaves who were advocating to make slavery illegal, is largely, it's a cause really led by middle class and upper middle class white women in the North. It's seen as sort of like a position that wives, that don't have to work and, commit to a cause. Their husbands are hardworking guys, but, and they support their wives, or their wives are, going to meetings and, and doing the active work. It's one of these things that women are seen in many cases for as patriarchal and sexist this time was. Women were seen to be the holders of moral virtue. This is probably a concept I've mentioned before in this class. So any sort of moral cause, it was seen up to women to kind of lead those things. But it was also sort of being like, oh, those women, you know how they are about that kind of stuff. But because this is the case, a lot of these women who are involved in this abolitionist movement, like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, all of these women who will go on to found, will meet at Seneca Falls and begin the early, push for the women's right to vote. They will learn their sort of activist and, organizational skills at abolitionist meetings. That's one of the things I talk about in my 17.2 class. So if you want more about that, I talk about Seneca Falls and all that stuff in that class. Even though that happens in 1840, we cover in this class, the longer story I cover in the other class. But this for now, I just wanted to sort of define what abolitionists are. One of the reasons a lot of people say, yeah, sure, we should outlaw slavery, that's fine. And, for one thing, it'll bankrupt the the South, a lot of people are sort of okay with that. But the big question is, what do we do with the former slaves? Like if we outlawed slavery tomorrow, we would have all of these people who are largely illiterate, who don't have, like, they have not lived in American civic society as free people. They know how to live. They don't know anything about legal, legal and civic society, and how to navigate that. They don't have a lot of skills. They have very specific skill sets. So what do we do? Like, even if it was right to free all these people, what do we do with them? The largest idea was we need to send them overseas, and it was thought, we can't. There's no way black and white people can live on this continent. I talked about this. We talk about Thomas Jefferson, and I'll talk about more when we get into Abraham Lincoln. But for a number of reasons, it was thought that if we free the slaves, they can't stay here. So they're trying to form slave colonies outside of the U.S. A lot of people, the most obvious idea was send them to Africa. They might say send them back to Africa, but of course those people had been here for generations. There's no sending back to Africa someone that whose family's been here for 200 years. But that seemed an obvious place to have slave colonies, and this was the idea of Liberia, which would begin with rich Americans donating money to this American Colonization Society that is going to slaves that are freed by legal means. They get freed by their masters, or they're able to save up and get freedom, or somebody buys their freedom or something like that. They can leave and go start this slave colony, which again seems like it could be a good idea. Unfortunately, when they show up in this area on the western coast of Africa, there's already people living there. There are Africans there, not African Americans. There are Africans that are living there, and they don't necessarily want these African Americans showing up and and they have a completely different way of life, and encroaching into their territory. So they're gonna butt heads in battle. It's gonna be very difficult to negotiate that. This new colony is always going to be underfunded, so it's never going to have enough food, medicine, building supplies, things like that. Is going to have a really rough go. They will eventually work out a government and constitution. It's going to be modeled after the U.S. This is their flag here, where we have the stars from the number of states. They just have the one star, but it's very much modeled after the United States, which is the case today. Of course, West Africa has its own set of problems in that part of the world, and unfortunately Liberia also has those problems. You can model yourself after the United States as much as you want, but the United States there's a lot of privileges the United States had that West Africa and Liberia did not have. They were not starting from the same point that we were, but by any means, and have not got as much over the years because of that, or along with that. So that was the overall idea. We need to send people overseas. We'll see Lincoln later on looking to settle people in like Haiti, Cuba, Honduras, Guatemala, trying to start these other slave colonies without much success. Of course, most slaves did not want to go to Africa because, like I said, they're Americans. However much they've been, discriminated against and maligned and shut out of civic life, they are still Americans. They still grow up here and have all of the sort of American ideals and beliefs and everything that culturally comes along with being an American, they also have, and they want to stay here. They don't know anything about Africa. They don't want to go there. So most are going to want to go north. If they're free legally, they can go north. But then of course there is the Underground Railroad, for places for slaves to be able to escape to. And the Underground Railroad, that we don't know exactly what, when it begins and when it takes on this name, but it is, George Washington talked about this, how he believed there's networks of people helping slaves escape and things like that. So, at least as far back then, Quakers had always been really involved in it. The Quakers were the first abolitionists, going back to the founding of Pennsylvania, saying you talk about slavery being wrong, and Pennsylvania would always have this, strong involvement, and it's close to, it's Virginia and Maryland, and it's very easy to try and help slaves escape there. So one of the things that first of all, the Underground Railroad, that needs to be said, it's not a railroad, it's not underground. I think every one of us, that when we first hear about this, has some sort of image in our head about of a train running through a tunnel with former slaves holding on to it or something like that. Obviously, that's not the case, but it's also not what most Americans think either, is some like super developed like spy network, or network of people who are like devoted, who spend all of their time helping slaves escape and all this stuff, and then get them to the next spot, and have all this stuff planned out. It was much looser and less organized than that, and really it's a lot of people who were just willing to help when they could, they're not going to bust people, they're not going to turn slaves in, and they'll offer help whenever they can. And that could be, of course, having a cellar that you could hide people in, you could hide slaves in, but also just being able to give them money or disguises or food, buying people tickets. I mean, a lot of cases it would be just to get out. The best way to get out of the South was getting some false papers and a ticket on board a boat in like Baltimore, and then sailing north to like Philadelphia. That was the easiest way to do it if you could forge those papers. It's a lot better than running through the forest, with slave catchers after you. So it's a much looser organization, and it's made up of people who are, are not, most of them are not doing this as their full-time thing. It's just helping when they can. There are people, that are definitely doing it full-time. Harriet Tubman is the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. She liked to say that she never lost a passenger. And I wish I could go more into detail in Tubman. This is one of those things in my race, ethnicity, and gender in American culture class. I talk about more, give you more of her story, at least spend a few more minutes on her. But she was someone who was born a slave and escaped when she was in her 20s, and the amazing thing was, went back. She escaped pretty much on her, with little help, and ended up. She kept going back. She settled in Pennsylvania, and she went back to try and get some family members. Ended up bringing other people back, and she went back at least like 19 times. Became like the most wanted woman in the South because of this. And I loved. She carried a gun with her, not because she was usually using it against slave catchers, but the thing, because lots of slaves lost their nerve. The first time she tried to escape with her brothers, they lost their nerve. And it's like, no, we got to go back. If we go back now, maybe we won't get punished too bad. We're never going to be able to escape. Like, let's just go back now. And she was like, what? No way, let's go. And they talked her into going back. She didn't want to go alone. So in the future, when she was running her own show of helping people escape, she carried a gun really to point at people and be like, no, you know what? You're putting all of us at risk because you're a coward at this, or that's not fair, because I think people legitimately have good reason to be scared, but because you're losing your nerve now, you're putting all of us at risk. You can't go home and you might rat us out. So you're dead, or you're going north, one or another. And she was kind of that kind of person. She was known to be, she's a tiny woman. She's only 5 feet tall. She's known to be able to pick up grown men, like big men, and carry them and run. She had this sort of like freakish sort of strength, they say. But when the Civil War broke out, she wanted to be involved. And at first she was doing, they had her be a nurse because, she's a woman. So that they figured that's all she could do. Then people would realize, like, oh, wait a minute, nobody knows the South, and sort of secret routes that, through these places better than her. So they made her a scout. And she had her own unit of, she's basically running her own spy network that reported directly to the Secretary of War. all without knowing how to read. She never learned how to read, but was able to keep incredible amounts of information in her head and was able to relay that. She also was the first woman to lead, first American woman to lead soldiers into battle. And I wish I could go into more detail about all of her stuff. She really is, one of those amazing people. And after the war, she spends the rest of her life doing everything she could to help former slaves. And one of the type of thing, every penny she gets, she would donate into things. And she said the thing she was most proud of in her entire life was this nursing home that she had founded for former slaves. It was founded in 1908. Like at this point, she was, I think, in her 80s. Then, and then she retired into that home and ended up dying there. But giving former slaves a place to live, the last years without being worried, about being kicked out of their houses and things like that, was the thing she was most proud of. Yeah. If you watch the movie Tubman that came out, or no, it was Harriet. It was called Harriet. The first half of it was very historically accurate. The second half really loses the thread at the end. But I don't know. It's kind of worth watching. So escaped slaves were, a big deal. When you're for as much as they're saying these people are property, most property just doesn't get up and walk away like that. And they're not animals. They're intelligent people that are smart, that realize they don't want to be enslaved anymore, and they have means to escape. So escape was a huge problem that we see going back to even before the signing of the Constitution. As soon as the colonies become states, this becomes an issue. There's a number of different fugitive slaves acts that were trying to encourage Northerners to give up, to work harder to send slaves back to the South. But Northerners just didn't want to do it. Most of them, even if they weren't abolitionists, did not feel that it's the right thing to do. Even if they're super racist, they don't feel like it's the right thing to send people back into slavery. If someone escaped, it is one thing to just be okay with slavery, but to actively help capture someone and send them back is a huge leap, from there. Part of the Compromise of 1850 was this new Fugitive Slave Act that would punish people who harbored runaway slaves, people like the Underground Railroad. There were, you could be put in prison for up to 6 months and have a $1,000 fine, which is $1,000 was a lot of money back then. It required law enforcement to arrest any person suspected of being a slave, even if the only evidence was the slave owner claiming they were slave. Basically, a slave catcher could just show up and say, like, that guy's a slave. He escaped from such and such place. I want him arrested and I'm taking him back south. And that was enough to be considered like this is proof. And of course, there were a lot of people who, were picked up. I mean, not as widespread as you would necessarily think of free people who were put back into slavery, but it was definitely something that happened. There was also large cash bonuses for Northern law enforcement who'd captured slaves. It also made it so any runaway who was arrested, accused of being a slave, couldn't ask for a jury trial to defend himself in court. So these were some pretty terrifying and un-American rules to put in place. And the weird thing is, Northerners still didn't go along with it. They were really pissed them off because it made them feel like you were trying to make us complicit in slavery. Like they've been getting more and more anti-slavery as time goes by, and this is only encouraging that. Just being like, we don't want anything to do with your corrupt system, and you people are parasites on society. As free labor ideology becomes more of a thing, we're not going to participate in that. Of course, there will always be people that want to cash in no matter what, but there are. It becomes more and more of a thing to try and resist, which will only make Southerners more mad. It's funny because about this thing too, the whole time Southerners are always talk about states' rights. They're all about states' rights. It's our state right to own slaves. The people in this state said that we have to, popular sovereignty. We voted for slavery. We have slavery, and that's our right. The federal government can't tell us what to do. But in this matter, they kept complaining, like, "Hey, the federal government said that you have to turn over our slaves." And like Vermont, they threatened to nullify the law, the same way South Carolina did back in the day with this. They said, we're just going to nullify this law. They ended up not doing that. But, that could have ended up being, a pretty big deal. But there were things that sort of like Massachusetts and Vermont, where they guaranteed jury trials. They found ways around to make sure people had some sort of justice system, so you couldn't just come grab anybody and take them back south. And then, the southern states would be like, hey, you're not following federal law. And, Vermont and Massachusetts are like, hey, states' rights. And like, no, you have to follow the law. So, this whole idea, it's one of the things that really sort of undercuts their whole thing about states' rights. They're all about it, unless it's something, the federal law, something that benefits them. But this again, just builds resentment on both sides, and it's going to sort of like increase sort of conspiracy theories on both sides about how, they're like that side is trying to do this to take away our freedoms, and everything that happens makes every side that much more suspicious about what's happening on the other side. One of the sort of big cultural moments that is going to make a lot of thousands of new abolitionists will be Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's a novel you've surely heard of, or you at least heard the term Uncle Tom in American culture. Like a black person who is, sucks up to white people is known as an Uncle Tom. But that comes from, and I'm not going to get into that whole term, but this is a novel written by a northern white woman who worked with the Underground Railroad, had connections to the Underground Railroad, so was able to interview a lot of former slaves. Her name is Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she was she used all this to construct a novel in which the slaves are the heroes of the book. It follows a slave family and depicts the slave owners as being villains. The white slave owners is these horrible villains. And the real genius of the whole thing was that it framed the issue of slavery into moral and religious terms that people could understand. This is a very, very religious time. There had been a new Great Awakening to really push, evangelicalism and this sort of religious fervor in the United States in the last couple of decades here. And there's a lot of people, everything was framed in the sense of how good of a Christian are you? And in this book, the slaves are seen as good, God-fearing Christians, and the slave owners are completely disregarding of the religion and are not being good Christians. And that framing really pushed a lot in people's minds. I don't ever recommend reading this book, by the way. It's very sentimental and long-winded and not well plotted. It's not a good book. I've tried to read it a couple times and it's like, I don't really need to read this. I know what's in here. Yeah, but anyway, so this was, huge. This was a major bestseller. The best-selling book in the 19th century, other than the Bible, in the United States. It even, within the first year, it sold 300,000 copies in the U.S. and even 1 million copies in Great Britain, where they had already outlawed slavery. The British Empire had outlawed slavery in 1832, so they were feeling very much morally superior to us at that point. And this book really pissed off Southerners. It became you couldn't sell it, and in southern towns, it'd be a good way to get run out of town. Your bookstore would get burnt to the ground if you sold this. Even having this book would be enough to get you lynched there. Harry Beecher Stowe got a bunch of hate mail and things like that. Even one hate mail of a letter that had a slave's ear in it. Something the guy did just to show her he could do it, which really tells you something about what they were doing. And that inspired this whole industry of books that like defended Southern slavery, in the South. They kept trying to write a book that would show the South the way they wanted it. And all that stuff was horrible too. But it was really the beginning of the South taking this sort of romantic view of themselves. They already had, but they're really starting to put that down on paper, which they're really going to embrace later on, this whole idea of there being the chivalrous Christian society, that is all about family and, and good moral virtue, and slavery fits into that perfectly. And, it's not really about cruelty. And the last part of this class, when we talk about Reconstruction, we'll get into that concept a little bit more, because that will really change history books for a long time, this view of the South. Apparently, Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe at the beginning of the Civil War and said, "This is the little lady that started the Great War." It's probably not true, but that's, sort of mythology. One of the things where we're talking about sort of Black stereotypes and this sort of idea of Uncle Tom's and things like that. When I was looking for pictures for Uncle Tom's Cabin, this came up. And there had been this long-running show that appears later on about Uncle Tom's Cabin. Now's as good a time as any to address these sort of Black stereotypes and where they come from. Again, in my race, ethnicity, and gender and American culture class, I spend whole classes, have multiple lectures on this concept of where these stereotypes come from. But in this class, we at least have enough time to spend looking at minstrel shows, which were the dominant form of American entertainment at this time. Minstrel shows were blackface performances, white actors painting their faces black, doing comedy sketches, playing music, dancing, having all this kind of stuff. And this is actually seen as America's first art form. It was the first thing that Americans did that nobody else did at this time. It began in the 1830s. A actor named T.D. Rice, I think he was in Pittsburgh, if I remember right. Maybe somewhere in New Jersey, somewhere in that part of the world, somewhere in the north though. It was saw a Black man working in a stable and singing to himself, and he decided like I like that song, I think that there's a market for this, and put on. Tore up his clothes, tore up some old clothes, painted his face black, came out on stage singing that song and sort of doing like a dance, and audiences loved it. And it just took off from there. And not only is it like America's first sort of unique art form, it becomes America's first like popular culture. It's the first thing that would, so, these type of things would have, there'd be performances, there'd be troops that were traveling around the country, playing in different places. Some troops would stay in places for a long time. You have, a bunch of these different like acting troops that would but they would use a lot of the same comedy and songs and things like that. And this made certain songs like popular that some of Camptown races, like Camptown ladies sing the song, doo-dah, doo-dah. That would become a staple of this. And the reason every American in every part of the country knew that song, because they were going and seeing these shows. Same thing with the comedy. Knock-knock jokes were basically like invented in this. And they have the same sort of knock-knock jokes that that everybody would hear. So it becomes like, in a time before TV or radio, things like that, all Americans had the same sort of shared culture because of minstrel shows. But obviously they're super racist. The whole reason that we, every year there'll be some white kids that, white high school or college students that paint their face black, because they want to be like, I'm just being my favorite rapper. And everybody's like, no, you can't do that. You can't do blackface. this is why. Because, you know, the predominant joke of these things was, look how ridiculous black people are. It was satirizing black culture, and you know, and then their faces are, you know, are painted really, really dark. You know, their lips look really bright, their eyes would, you know, purposely sort of bulging out, and just their physical appearance, but also in just the way they talk. And the whole joke was, you know, about, you know, black people being either lazy or trying to act like they're smart, and they can't. You know, every time they try to act like white people, they end up looking stupid, or about about them sort of trying to suck up the white people. And this is not just popular in the North, or in the South. This is very popular in the North. In places, you know, somewhere like Wisconsin or something like that, where they had never seen a black person in their entire life, they would think this is what black people are like. This is part of why it was so damaging. It's not just that, like, you know, that it makes black people look bad. It made white people believe this. Often when I teach about this and I have more questions about this, my students will be like, oh, it made black people feel bad, you know, bad for their self-esteem. And I think that's something really, that's some sort of generational thing, like millennial and, you know, and Gen Zs, that fake hurt feelings are like the worst thing. Whereas me as a Gen Xer, I'm like, it's not about hurt feelings, man. It's about like that it was, like, white people had this idea of this is what black people are like, and that helped further excuse slavery. It helped them be like, oh, okay, well, these people should be enslaved. Like they like it. You know, it makes them, they're docile people, and they're stupid, and they need to be enslaved. After the Civil War and they get freed, this will help the you know, help justify, you know, the Jim Crow South and white supremacy in the South, being like, oh, if black people, you know, if they're given any rights, that, you know, they'll become violent, you know, and then, like, you really see this image of them being like very docile before the Civil War shift into them being like very violent and wild and savage coming after the Civil War. And all of that, you know, permeating through the popular culture is because it helped justify the system. So it's not really so damaging because of how the black people felt. It's how white people felt, because it justified white supremacy in every way. So yeah, sorry, I've taught this section a number of times, so I get I know where people like this, where people get impressions, and I want to like give the accurate impression of what I want to get across. And it's just sort of ridiculous. This, like, it also has this idea that people, like, two things that, you know, kind of hold in their head is that, you know, we already know, we've seen slave owners having like this idea of like, slaves are just part of the family. They love it. They should be enslaved. And also, we better watch them or they're going to cut our throats while we sleep. You know, they could hold those two opposing ideas. And the same way, you know, people in the North that would see something like this, that could be like, oh, those people are so dumb and they have no culture, and it's a good thing you're enslaved. And at the same time being like, wow, they have great music. You know, like there is something of this first sort of like white appropriation of black culture. Like, you know, right here at the beginning, there is something in black culture that white people have always like, sort of valued, even as they devalue black people themselves. And you could have white people do things on the stage that you would not necessarily have them do in public life. You know, if they're in blackface, they can do other things. And I'm going to play some clips here. I don't like showing this stuff very much because it is so racist. But I think it's worth it. You know, so you guys can get an idea, so you can see you know, what this type of thing like. This is from a TV show in the 1950s, where blackface and, you know, minstrel shows that were going out of style. And then, you know, the era of television, you don't see something like this as much. This has definitely been like a throwback at the time, but there was definitely still blackface performances going on into the 1960s. But just keep in mind that, you know, this is a sort of later thing, whereas most minstrelsy was done basically between like 1830 and 1930. So yeah, and like I said, this is a 1950.
Emmett Miller and Chess Davis.
Oh, you better do it. Eat our shutter.
Man, I'm hungry. I want something to eat.
That's all you talk about is something to eat.
Well, that's all I do is talk about it. I don't ever get nothing. When I left my good job on that minister show, what did you tell me?
What I done told you?
You said, come on, go with me, boy. We gonna have fancy drinks. Horse's neck, pussycat's tail, gin frizzle. I ain't drink nothing but water. Drink so much water, my stomach think I'm taking and washing. I'm hungry.
Didn't I tell you I'd stick with you through thick and thin?
Yeah, and the longer you stick, the thinner I get. I be so thin.
All right, you get the idea. It's not funny. So, like, yeah, even aside from, you know, the kind of over-the-top racism, it still wouldn't be funny. But you do kind of see in that like there was, you know, that sort of back and forth in comedy that, you know, will become vaudeville, you know, and make its way into sort of the Abbott and Costello bits. It becomes American comedy, this going back and forth. Like, you know, Americans sort of invented popular comedy, like, you know, popular entertainment around the world. Its roots, you know, all American entertainment comes out of minstrelsy. This is a dance performance. Gives you an idea that, you know, something that, you know, of a white person doing something that he would, you know, not do if he was not in blackface.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Ned Haverly.
I want you to know that I'm a ragged but right, whole black and living like you people ask why. Porterhouse steak every day for my board. That's more than all you rounders in this town can afford. I'm a mighty good man to have hanging around. I'm tailor-made, I'm not a hand-me-down. I'm a eagle, I'm a mason, I'm a elk, I'm a knight. I'm ragged but right, you hear me talking? I'm ragged but right.
Yes, very impressive. Yeah, come on, man. Anyhow, whoops, close this one. It gives you an idea, you know, of what that looked like. So again, if this interests you, here, actually, I think something's messing up when I share the sound there. Oops. Nope. If that topic interests you at all, then you'll like my race, ethnicity, and gender and American culture class. It's History 21 at SRJC. It's my favorite class to teach. The most popular, most effective defender of slavery was actually a Northerner, Stephen A. Douglas. Really the powerhouse of American politics at this time. He was never president, but he did run for president. And we'll talk about him a little bit later in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. He's the guy that Abraham Lincoln debates. But he's a senator from Illinois. He's a Northern Democrat. And he's effective, you know, because he has, you know, great sort of rhetoric for this, but, you know, because he doesn't debate for slavery, he debates for popular sovereignty. He's always about this idea of, you know, the people who have the right to vote in any areas, and you know, that's going to keep us out of the war. Like, you know, if we're worried about civil war, we could, you know, if the people are able to vote in particular areas, then, you know, there's nothing to fight about because those people decided. So, it's up to each state to be able to decide. That was his case. And it'll help sort of maintain the balance and status quo that had been going on. We'll come back to Stephen Douglas later. The president in the first part of the 1850s here, Franklin Pierce, in the mid-1850s, was also a Northern Democrat from New England who thought abolitionists would basically that would drive the country into war. They were trying to, their extreme position was too uncompromising, and that was what's going to push the country towards civil war. So even this New Hampshire, Democrat or New England president that you'd think might be pro-slavery ended up coming down on the side of the slave states most often. He also becomes so unpopular, because we're going to see what's happened with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, that he's the only president not to get his party's nomination. He's only sitting president, not automatically nominated to run again. And apparently when he said, after the Constitutional Convention, when he found out he wasn't nominated to be the president, he said, there's nothing left to do but get drunk, which, I don't know, I've been there. I'm going to skip past this for the sake of time. We don't have a lot of stuff left in this. I talk about this in my California history class about how this nut job, William Walker, tried to invade Baja California to make it a slave state. And he actually did. He took over Baja California for a little while. But it turned out at the same time, Franklin Pierce was trying to buy Baja California and make it into a slave state, and the whole deal got messed up because this psychopath, William Walker, came along and conquered it. So Mexico didn't want to sell it anymore. It's a long story. I don't want to waste a bunch of time with it because it's not all that important to the larger point. We have limited time left. But that's the end of that deal did end up buying the diplomat in Mexico named William Gadsden ended up buying this little piece of the Mexican state of Sonora, and that became the final part of Arizona and New Mexico, and we have the finalized borders. So, what I do have to talk about, though, Franklin Pierce and Stephen Douglas drafted the Kansas-Nebraska Act and got this passed through Congress. And this was after the Compromise of 1850 that, these new territories, had been created. This was going to create 2 more territories, the Nebraska and Kansas territory, that also came along with a bunch of other things. It opens up a bunch of farmland to be used in these areas. It's going to a bunch of railway traffic going through there. There's all kinds of things. How this new territory is going to work, but it also gets rid of that line of the like I talked about the Missouri Compromise about how here's this line where slavery is allowed up here and not up here. It gets rid of that. So that's why I didn't really go into detail on it. And because it says popular sovereignty is the thing in any new territory. And in these territories, we're opening this up, and people are going to move into Nebraska and Kansas, and they are going to be allowed to vote. Do you want slavery or do you not want slavery? That's gonna be their choice. So, okay, seems fair enough, right? Not so much. People start moving there, and they say, okay, we're having an election day here in 1855 to say, what are we gonna? Are we a slave state or are we a free state? And a bunch of pro-slavery people from Missouri came across the border. Missouri and Kansas are right next to each other. They just go across the river and voted. Even though they didn't live there, they voted for it. So that obviously skewed the election, and everybody knew this happened. And Congress avoided that. They said, okay, that's not, that's no good. We have to throw out that election and have another one. Now knowing that this happened, they called them border ruffians. These people that cross the border and, and do this voting, they're going to start a bunch of trouble as well. They do this. Now, abolitionists and, anti-slavery people from the North say, okay, well, we're going to go into Kansas and even the odds. If they're going to sneak across the state and do that, we're going to do it too, and that will balance it out. So now you have all these people going to abolitionists, the most extreme anti-slavery people going into there. The vote happens again. It also goes in favor of slavery again, but it's the same problem. They know all these border ruffians that had come across, a bunch of fighting had broken out, election boxes were stolen. There's no way this thing was legitimate. So at this point, Franklin Pierce, the president, says, okay, well, slavery won, so Kansas is a slave state. But everyone went like, what? No, that's bullshit. How can you do that? Like you're a joke president. How could you just decide something like that? This is why he doesn't get nominated again, because he so bungles this whole thing. But now you have these two camps of people, the pro-slavery and anti-slavery sides in Kansas, both of them with you had the most extreme people, the most the most passionate about it, and they're both going to set up their own governments there. The pro-slavery side is going to start up, is going to make a Kansas capital in Lecompton. The anti-slavery side is going to make a capital in Topeka, and they're both going to claim they're going to have elections, and they're both going to claim to be the legitimate government of Kansas. Obviously, this is untenable. This is not something that's supposed to work in the American system. This is not democracy working under the American system. American system, there has to be one side, but like, how do we know if you can't trust an election like this? This is, in general, is going to really divide trust in elections. He's going to play into sort of conspiracies and voting and things like that, which is actually something I need to add to a slide a little bit here. So you have these two capitals. Inevitably, violence is going to break out. Battles will break up and flare up, really bloody battles, throughout, up until and through the Civil War, up until 1865, they're going to be fighting over Kansas. One of the more famous people in Kansas was a Massachusetts man named John Brown, who was a very extreme abolitionist. He began as an abolitionist. He started a militia in Springfield, Massachusetts that would chase out slave catchers. Any slave catcher who tried to come into Springfield, they would basically open fire on them, and make, Springfield to be like sort of like a sanctuary city. And that's great. Brown was one of the few white people who really did believe in Black equality. He was like, did not, one of the few people that, no sense of white supremacy. He was willing to share, at the table, his bed at times, completely, did not see, he saw full equality between Black and white and fought alongside plenty of Black people in his time, which was a pretty rare thing of that day. I think even for abolitionists. But unfortunately, Brown was also kind of a terrorist and kind of bloodthirsty. In Kansas, some of the bloodiest massacres, really stuff that's not even battles, kind of going and attacking houses and farms of slave owners, or even pro-slavery people, and just killing entire families in the middle of the night. So though his cause was good, his methods were not. He's also, we're going to see in the next lecture, he's going to do something kind of crazy that really helps start the Civil War. But we'll get to that later. So significance of Bleeding Kansas, why is this important? I'd said that, it erodes trust in elections, and, and in trust in each other, in the American people, trust in government to be able to settle disputes. But also, proves that Americans are willing to kill each other over this sort of ideological debate. This between slavery and free labor. Murder is becoming an acceptable solution to that. And that helps make Civil War seem that much more realistic later on. If these people had not already started killing each other, then Civil War would have seemed crazier when it appears 6 years later. Franklin Pierce is finishes his presidency. Everybody, he's up there for, he's bottom 5, worst presidents of all time, probably. And a lot of that, because he thinks he's trying to prevent war, but everybody sees that as just being too accommodating to the slave power of the South. And this is going to push a lot of Northern Democrats that are like, that's it, that's the last straw, we're out of here. And that big exodus of Northern Democrats is going to basically what kickstarts the Republican Party, which I'll talk about next time. The last thing I want to talk about today, when we're talking about coming to blows before the Civil War, I got to talk about the time that a senator a congressman almost killed a senator, on the floor of Congress, and was beat him to death. So Massachusetts Republican, wait, here, make sure this way. Okay, Massachusetts. Like I said, Republican hasn't party started yet, but it will soon. They're going to be the very anti-slavery side. Gives a speech for Congress saying, "Not in any common lust for the power did this uncommon tragedy have its origin. It is the rape of virgin territory, compelling it to hateful embrace of slavery. It may be clearly traced to the depraved desire of a slave state and the hideous offspring of the crime, and hopes that adding the power of slavery in the national government." I don't know, it's a pretty wordy way to say something, but you can tell that, idea of rape, depraved, the sort of hideous words that he's using. Then he'll go on to describe a fellow Southern Senator, Andrew Butler, as being in the thrall of the mistress whose name is slavery, and she is a harlot. This is too much for a South Carolina Democrat congressman named Preston Brooks, who 2 days later will walk up to Sumner, who's sitting at his desk in the Senate, and just start wailing on him with his cane. He's beating him with his cane. And Sumner falls out of his chair, and Preston keeps beating until his cane breaks, and still keeps going until the Senate sergeant at arms comes in and finally pulls him away. Sumner will take 3 years to fully recover, and apparently he's never quite the same. He's always a little bit messed up after this from head injuries and things like that. And the House expels Brooks for doing this, so they have to have a special election to see who's going to take a seat, and he's allowed to run again in his district, and he wins. He runs on I'm going to defend Southern honor so much that I'll beat people on the floor of the Senate. And the voters of South Carolina are like, yeah, awesome. Vote for him again. So he actually wins, but on his way back to Washington, he catches the croup, which is a respiratory virus, and he dies before returning to the office. But this is one of those sort of famous things. For as much as we are partisan today in this country, we have not seen a representative try to beat a senator to death yet. All right. That is it. That went a little longer than I expected to, but thanks for listening to the extra lecture today. I'm going to post the quiz up shortly. I'm going to start making that right now. I'll see you guys next week.